The gunshot echoed across the plains, but it wasn't meant for Harriet Zimmerman. It was merely a signal that her brother's stagecoach had departed from North Platte, Nebraska, leaving her behind with nothing but a carpetbag and a letter of introduction to a ranch she couldn't find. The late summer sky of 1874 hung heavy with dark clouds that promised the kind of rain that transformed docile creek beds into raging torrents. "Madam, you sure you don't want to wait until tomorrow?" The station manager's weathered face creased with concern. "Storms coming in fast from the west." Harriet straightened her spine, adjusting the bonnet that covered her chestnut hair. At 22, she'd traveled alone from Philadelphia to this frontier town, and she wasn't about to let a little weather deter her now. "I've been assured it's just a short ride to the Silver Creek Ranch," she said, her voice steady despite her uncertainty. "Mr. Collins promised to send someone to meet me, but I see no one." The station manager shook his head. "Collins's place is a good 10 miles southwest, miss. And ain't nobody coming from there today. Old man Collins broke his leg last week, and his hands are busy with the herd." Harriet's confidence faltered. Her teaching position at the newly established school on Silver Creek Ranch wouldn't begin for another week, but she'd arrived early, hoping to settle in. Now, with the clouds darkening by the minute, she faced her first real crisis in this unfamiliar territory. "Is there a room available in town?" she asked, resigned to changing her plans. "Not likely. Railroad surveyors have taken most every bed." He glanced at the horizon where lightning flickered. Though I suppose the thunder of hoofbeats interrupted him as a rider appeared from the east, his horse kicking up dust. As he drew closer, Harriet could see he was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered beneath a worn leather duster. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face until he reined in his mount before them. "Afternoon, Mason," the station manager called. "Thought you'd be securing the herds before this weather hits." The rider Mason dismounted in one fluid motion. When he pushed his hat back, Harriet found herself looking into eyes the color of a summer sky, set in a sun-bronzed face that spoke of years under the open heavens. "Herds secure," he said, his voice deep but gentle. "Mr. Collins sent me to fetch the new schoolteacher." His gaze settled on Harriet, assessing her city clothes and delicate appearance with a hint of skepticism. "I'm Mason Xavier, foreman at Silver Creek." Relief washed over Harriet. "I'm Harriet Zimmerman. I was beginning to think I'd been forgotten." A small smile curved his lips. "Silver Creek doesn't forget its promises, Miss Zimmerman, but we need to ride now if we're going to beat this storm." The station manager shook his head. "You won't beat it, Mason. Look at those clouds." Mason's jaw tightened as he studied the approaching tempest. "We can make it to Cottonwood Canyon. There's a line shack there where we can wait it out if needed." Harriet hesitated. The prospect of riding through a storm with a stranger wasn't what she'd envisioned for her arrival in North Platte, but the alternative, being stranded in a town with no accommodation, seemed worse. "I'm afraid I don't ride," she admitted, gesturing to her traveling dress. "At least not astride." Mason's expression remained impassive, though Harriet thought she detected a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "Don't worry, miss. Rusty here is gentle as they come, and I've brought a lead rope. You can ride, and I'll walk alongside." As if to punctuate the urgency, a gust of wind whipped around them, nearly carrying off Harriet's bonnet. She clutched it with one hand, making her decision. "Very well, Mr. Xavier. I place myself in your capable hands." Within minutes, Mason had secured Harriet's carpetbag to his saddle and helped her mount. She sat awkwardly sideways on the saddle, her skirts arranged as modestly as possible. Mason took the reins and started walking, leading them away from the station. "Be careful," the station manager called after them. "Creek beds will flood fast." They'd barely cleared the town limits when the first fat raindrops began to fall. Mason quickened their pace, his long strides eating up the distance as they headed southwest. The open prairie stretched before them, the tall grasses bending in the strengthening wind. "How much farther to this canyon you mentioned?" Harriet asked, raising her voice above the growing rumble of thunder. 3 miles, Mason replied, his expression grim as he scanned the horizon. "But we need to change course. That wash to the west is already flooding." Harriet followed his gaze and saw brown water churning across what had likely been a dry gully hours earlier. The rain was falling harder now, plastering her dress to her legs and soaking through her lightweight jacket. Despite her discomfort, she couldn't help but be impressed by Mason's calm assessment of their situation. "What's the new plan?" she asked, pushing wet strands of hair from her face. "Cottonwood Canyon has high ground and shelter. It's closer than turning back to town." He glanced up at her, rain streaming down his face. "Can you hold on if we move faster?" Harriet nodded, gripping the saddle horn tighter. Mason swung up behind her in one smooth motion, his chest warm against her back as he reached around to take the reins. She stiffened at the impropriety of their position, but the urgency of their situation overrode her concerns. "Lean back against me," he instructed. "It'll be easier to balance." They rode in silence for what felt like hours, but was likely only 30 minutes, the rain becoming a torrent that reduced visibility to mere yards. When the terrain began to rise and rocky outcroppings appeared through the curtain of rain, Harriet realized they must be nearing the canyon Mason had mentioned. "Almost there," he confirmed, sensing her recognition. "The shack's just over this rise." But as they crested the hill, what they saw below made Mason swear under his breath. The narrow entrance to the canyon was already half submerged in swirling, muddy water that rose visibly with each passing minute. "The line shack's on higher ground inside," Mason explained, urgency in his voice. "But we need to get through that gap before it's completely flooded." He spurred the horse forward, descending the slope toward the canyon entrance. The water was knee-deep on the horse when they reached the gap, and Rusty balked, unwilling to proceed further. "Whoa, boy," Mason soothed, patting the animal's neck. He dismounted into the water and looked up at Harriet. "I'm going to lead him through. If he panics, grab his mane and hold on." Harriet nodded, too cold and frightened to speak. Mason began leading Rusty into the canyon, the water now reaching his thighs. They'd made it halfway through the gap when a massive surge of water rounded a bend upstream, rushing toward them with terrifying speed. "Run!" Harriet screamed. Mason reacted instantly, slapping Rusty's flank and shouting, "Go!" The horse lunged forward, carrying Harriet through the gap just as the wall of water hit. She turned back in horror to see Mason swept off his feet, disappearing beneath the churning flood. "Mason!" She screamed, but her voice was lost in the roar of the water. Rusty, driven by instinct, scrambled up the canyon wall to higher ground. Harriet clung desperately to the saddle, her heart pounding as she searched the raging water for any sign of Mason. For several agonizing moments, she saw nothing. Then, about 50 yards downstream, she spotted him clinging to a protruding rock, the current battering him mercilessly. Without thinking, Harriet slid from the saddle. The line shack Mason had mentioned was visible now, perched on a ledge above the flood line. She fumbled with the saddlebags, praying she'd find something useful. Her hands closed around a coil of rope. "Hold on," she shouted, though she doubted Mason could hear her. Harriet had never thrown a lasso in her life, but she'd watched her brother practice during his brief cowboy phase back east. She fashioned a crude loop, tied the other end to Rusty's saddle horn, and moved as close to the edge as she dared. "Please," she whispered and threw. The rope fell short, carried sideways by the wind. Harriet pulled it back, reorganized the loop, and tried again. On her third attempt, the loop landed near Mason. He lunged for it, missed, and was nearly swept away before regaining his hold on the rock. "One more try," Harriet promised herself, sending up a silent prayer. This time the loop landed within Mason's reach. He grabbed it with one hand, then the other, wrapping it around his wrist. Harriet quickly secured her end to a sturdy tree and called to Mason to pull himself along the rope toward the bank. Hand over hand, fighting against the current, Mason inched toward safety. When he reached the shallows, Harriet waded in, heedless of her soaked skirts, and helped him crawl onto the rocky shore. They collapsed together on the ground, gasping for breath. "You saved my life," Mason managed between coughs as water spilled from his lungs. Harriet, shivering uncontrollably, could only nod. The rain continued to fall, but they were momentarily safe on their elevated perch. Mason struggled to his feet first, extending his hand to help Harriet up. "The shack," he said. "We need to get warm." The line shack was little more than a one-room cabin with a small porch, but to Harriet, it looked like a palace. Inside, Mason quickly set about building a fire in the stone fireplace, while Harriet stood dripping on the rough wooden floor. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, not looking at her as he coaxed flames from the dry kindling stored beside the hearth. "There should be some spare clothes in that trunk. They won't fit well, but they'll be dry." Harriet hesitated, painfully aware of the impropriety, but the prospect of pneumonia was more frightening than impropriety at that moment. She found a flannel shirt and worn canvas pants in the trunk, along with a blanket. "Turn around, please," she requested. Mason obediently faced the fire while Harriet struggled out of her sodden dress, petticoats, and corset, leaving only her thin chemise. She pulled on the oversized shirt and pants, rolling up the legs and sleeves to make them somewhat manageable. "You can turn now," she said, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders for additional modesty. Mason had removed his duster and outer shirt, leaving him in a damp undershirt that clung to his muscular frame. He'd found another blanket and had draped it over his shoulders. "The storm may last through the night," he said, gesturing for her to sit near the fire. "But we'll be safe here. The canyon walls are high enough that even if the water rises more, it won't reach us." Harriet nodded, suddenly exhausted. The reality of their situation stranded together, unchaperoned, should have concerned her more, but the day's events had left her too drained to worry about social niceties. "Thank you for saving me from the station," she said quietly, "even if we did end up in this predicament." A smile touched Mason's lips, warming his eyes. "I believe you're the one who saved me, Miss Zimmerman." "Harriet," she corrected. "I think after today, formalities seem rather unnecessary." "Harriet," he repeated, her name sounding different in his deep voice. "How does a city girl like you know how to throw a rope like that?" she laughed softly. "My brother went through a phase of wanting to be a cowboy. He practiced in our garden in Philadelphia until our mother put a stop to it." Her smile faded. "I never thought I'd need to use those observations in a life or death situation." Mason stoked the fire, adding another log. "Life out here has a way of testing what you know and what you're made of." He studied her with newfound respect. "You passed that test today." Outside, the rain continued to fall, and the roar of water through the canyon provided a constant backdrop to their conversation. As the fire's warmth seeped into her bones, Harriet found herself studying Mason more closely. Despite his rough exterior, there was an intelligence in his eyes and a gentleness in his manner that surprised her. "How long have you worked at Silver Creek?" she asked. "5 years," he replied. "Came west after the war with nothing but my horse and the clothes on my back. Mr. Collins gave me a chance when others wouldn't." He hesitated. "I had some demons to work through back then." Harriet nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The war changed many men. My father was never the same after he came home from Gettysburg." "Is that why you came west?" "To escape those memories," she smiled sadly. "No, my parents passed 3 years ago influenza. My brother has his own family now, and I needed to make my own way. Teaching seemed like a good option, and when I saw the advertisement for a position at a ranch school in Nebraska, something about it called to me." Mason nodded, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "It takes courage to travel so far alone." "Or desperation," she countered with a small smile. "Perhaps a bit of both." The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the small cabin. Outside, the storm continued its assault, but inside, a different kind of warmth was beginning to grow. "You should try to sleep," Mason suggested, moving to create a makeshift pallet near the fire. "I'll keep watch." "What about you?" Harriet asked. "I've gone longer without sleep," he assured her. "Rest. Tomorrow we'll need to find a way back to the ranch." Despite her exhaustion, Harriet found sleep elusive. She lay on the rough blanket, listening to the storm and watching Mason through half-closed eyes as he sat by the fire, occasionally adding wood to maintain the flames. There was something comforting about his steady presence, something that made her feel safe despite the raging elements outside. Eventually, the rhythm of the rain and the warmth of the fire lulled her into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were chaotic swirling water, reaching hands and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. When Harriet awoke, pale morning light was filtering through the single small window of the lined shack. The rain had stopped, though she could still hear the rush of water outside. Mason was no longer by the fire. Panic fluttered in her chest until the door opened and he stepped inside, his clothes still damp but his expression relieved. "The water's receding," he reported. but it'll be a while before we can safely leave. The good news is Rusty's find found him grazing up the canyon, and I managed to salvage your carpet bag. It's a bit wet, but the contents should be mostly dry." Harriet sat up, running a hand through her tangled hair. "That is good news, thank you." Mason set the bag beside her and moved to rekindle the fire, which had burned down to embers overnight. "I found some coffee and jerky in the supplies. Not much of a breakfast, but it'll keep us going." As they shared the simple meal, Harriet became increasingly aware of the irregularity of their situation. Here she was, alone with a man she'd just met, wearing men's clothing, her hair unbound. Her mother would have fainted at the mere thought. "What will people think when we return?" she asked suddenly. "About us spending the night here, I mean." Mason looked up from his coffee, understanding in his eyes. "The folks at Silver Creek aren't quick to judge, especially when survival is at stake. But if you're concerned, we can say we waited out the storm in separate areas of the canyon." Harriet nodded, grateful for his sensitivity to her reputation. "I suppose the truth that you nearly died saving me, and I merely returned the favor, is dramatic enough without adding scandal." A smile tugged at Mason's lips. "Is that what happened? I recall it differently. I believe it was you who saved me, after I rather foolishly got swept into the flood." "Perhaps we saved each other," Harriet suggested, meeting his gaze. Something unspoken passed between them in that moment, a connection forged in shared danger and mutual respect. Harriet looked away first, surprised by the warmth rising to her cheeks. They spent the morning allowing their clothes to dry by the fire and watching the water level in the canyon continue to drop. Mason told her stories of Silver Creek, the people she would be teaching, the beauty of the land in different seasons, the challenges and rewards of ranch life. Harriet found herself increasingly enchanted, both by the picture he painted and by the man himself. By early afternoon, Mason deemed it safe enough to attempt leaving the canyon. The water had receded significantly, leaving behind a path of debris and mud, but exposing enough dry ground for them to travel safely. Harriet had changed back into her own clothes, which were now mostly dry if somewhat wrinkled. When she emerged from the shack in her proper attire, she caught Mason looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. "What is it?" she asked, smoothing down her skirt self-consciously. "Nothing," he said quickly. "It's just, you look like a proper school teacher again." Harriet raised an eyebrow. As opposed to the woman who threw a perfect lasso in the middle of a flood and pulled a grown man to safety," he replied with a hint of a smile. "It's hard to reconcile the two." "Perhaps there's more to proper school teachers than meets the eye, Mr. Xavier," she said, her own smile teasing. "Perhaps there is, Miss Zimmerman." Their journey back to Silver Creek Ranch was considerably slower than their flight to the canyon had been. Mason insisted on walking alongside Rusty while Harriet rode, despite her protests that they could take turns. The landscape, transformed by the deluge, revealed both destruction and renewal: uprooted trees and washed-out trails alongside vibrant wildflowers that had sprung up overnight, their faces turned eagerly toward the sun. "It's beautiful," Harriet remarked as they crested a hill and the valley opened up before them. "Even after such devastation," Mason nodded. "That's the way of things out here. The same forces that destroy also create, that flood that nearly killed us. It'll bring new life to these plains in ways we can't even imagine yet." By late afternoon, they spotted the buildings of Silver Creek Ranch in the distance: a large main house, several smaller cabins, barns, and corrals spread across the valley floor. As they approached, a rider galloped out to meet them. "Mason," the man called, "we thought you might have been caught in the flood. Mr. Collins has been worried sick." "We're fine, Joe," Mason replied. "Had to take shelter in Cottonwood Canyon. This is Miss Zimmerman, the new school teacher." Joe tipped his hat to Harriet. "Madam, we're mighty glad to see you both safe. There's been some damage around the ranch, but nothing we can't fix." When they finally reached the main house, they were met by Theodore Collins himself, a robust man in his 60s with a splinted leg propped on a footstool. Despite his injury, he insisted on rising to greet Harriet properly. "Miss Zimmerman, what an ordeal for your first day in North Platte." "I can't apologize enough for the circumstances." "Please, Mr. Collins, no apologies necessary," Harriet assured him. Mr. Xavier took excellent care of me. Without his quick thinking, I might have been stranded in town during the flood. Collins cast a knowing look at his foreman. Mason's always had good instincts. Now you must be exhausted. Mrs. Peterson will show you to your quarters in the schoolhouse. It's not fancy, but it's comfortable enough. The schoolhouse was a simple but sturdy structure situated a short distance from the main house. The upper floor had been converted into living quarters for the teacher, a bedroom, small sitting room, and a tiny kitchen. Mrs. Peterson, the cook from the main house, had prepared the space with fresh linens and had even placed wildflowers in a jar on the table. "Dinner's at 6 in the main house," the older woman informed Harriet. "Mr. Collins likes all the ranch folk to eat together, especially on Sundays, says it builds community." After Mrs. Peterson left, Harriet sank onto the bed, overwhelmed by the events of the past 24 hours. She'd arrived expecting to begin a new, quiet life as a schoolteacher. Instead, she'd faced death, saved a man's life, and spent a night alone with him in a lined shack all before she'd even begun her duties. A knock at her door roused her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Mason stood there, clean-shaven and dressed in fresh clothes, his wet things replaced by a crisp blue shirt that matched his eyes. "Mr. Collins asked me to check if you need anything," he said, his hat in his hands, "and to escort you to dinner when you're ready." "That's very kind," Harriet replied. "I'll just need a few minutes to make myself presentable." She closed the door and leaned against it, her heart beating unexpectedly fast. There was something about Mason Xavier that unsettled her, not in a frightening way, but in a way that made her feel both vulnerable and strangely alive. It was a feeling she'd never experienced before, and it both intrigued and alarmed her. Dinner at Silver Creek was a lively affair. Besides Mr. Collins and Mason, there were Joe and 3 other cowboys, Mrs. Peterson and her husband, who served as the ranch's blacksmith, and a young woman named Sarah who assisted with household duties. Everyone welcomed Harriet warmly, asking about her journey west and her teaching experience. "I hope you don't mind teaching all ages," Mr. Collins said as they enjoyed Mrs. Peterson's apple pie. "We've got children from 6 to 16 who will be attending your school. Some of the hands might join for evening lessons to those who want to improve their reading and figures." "I would be delighted," Harriet replied sincerely. "Education should be available to anyone willing to learn, regardless of age." She noticed Mason watching her from across the table, a thoughtful expression on his face. When their eyes met, he didn't look away but offered a small, private smile that sent an unexpected warmth through her. As the days passed, Harriet settled into life at Silver Creek. The schoolhouse needed some repairs after the storm, so she spent her mornings helping with the cleanup and her afternoons organizing her teaching materials and getting to know the families whose children would be her students. To her surprise, Mason frequently found reasons to be near the schoolhouse, fixing the roof, replacing broken windows, building new bookshelves. His work was always necessary and his manner professional, but Harriet couldn't help noticing how his gaze lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking one afternoon. As she struggled to hang a map of the United States on the schoolroom wall, Mason appeared in the doorway. "Need some help?" He offered. "Yes, please," Harriet admitted, standing on tiptoes on a chair that wasn't quite tall enough. "I can't seem to reach high enough." Mason crossed the room in a few strides, taking the hammer and nails from her hand. "Allow me." He completed the task easily, his height an advantage. As he worked, Harriet found herself studying the strong line of his jaw, the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the gentle care he took with her precious map. "There," he said, stepping back to admire his handiwork. "Straight as an arrow. Thank you." Harriet cleared her throat, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "You've been very helpful with all the repairs. I'm sure you have more important duties as foreman." Mason shrugged, his eyes meeting hers. "Mr. Collins believes education is important, so do I. Besides," he added with a hint of a smile, "I have a vested interest in making sure this school succeeds." "Oh," Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Do you have children I don't know about, Mr. Xavier?" He laughed, the sound warming the room. No children, but I never had much schooling myself. Learned to read from my mother, but after she passed, there wasn't much opportunity. Picked up what I could here and there." Understanding dawned on Harriet. "You mentioned the hands might join for evening lessons." Mason nodded, a hint of vulnerability in his expression. If that wouldn't be too much trouble, I can read well enough, but writing and mathematics, I could use some improvement. Harriet felt a surge of admiration for this man who had saved her life and was now humble enough to admit his own educational needs. It would be my pleasure to teach you, Mason. We could start before the school officially opens if you'd like. The smile he gave her then was like the sun breaking through clouds. I'd like that very much, Harriet. Their first lesson took place that very evening. Harriet prepared the schoolroom with care, lighting extra lamps and selecting materials that would challenge Mason without making him feel inadequate. When he arrived, hat in hand and freshly washed after his day's work, there was a boyish nervousness about him that she found endearing. "I hope you don't mind, but I've asked Mrs. Peterson to leave us some coffee," Harriet said, gesturing to the pot warming on the small stove in the corner. "I thought it might make our session more comfortable." Mason smiled gratefully. "That was thoughtful of you." They began with an assessment of his skills. As he'd said, his reading was quite good, self-taught but fluent. His writing was laborious but legible, and his mathematics basic but functional. "You've done remarkably well for someone without formal education," Harriet told him sincerely. "We'll focus on improving your writing speed and confidence with numbers, perhaps some history and geography as well if you're interested." "I'm interested in anything you want to teach me," Mason replied, his eyes meeting hers across the desk. The intensity of his gaze made Harriet's breath catch. For a moment, she wondered if they were still talking about academic subjects. Then Mason looked down at his slate, breaking the spell. Their evening lessons became a regular occurrence, a private time that both looked forward to with increasing anticipation. Harriet discovered that Mason was a quick learner, hungry for knowledge and unafraid to ask questions. For his part, Mason found Harriet to be a patient teacher who never made him feel ignorant, even when he struggled. As September gave way to October, the school officially opened. Harriet now spent her days with the children of Silver Creek and neighboring homesteads, but she continued to meet with Mason 3 evenings a week. Their relationship remained proper teacher and student, but there was an undeniable current between them, a connection that had been forged in danger and was deepening through their shared passion for learning. On a crisp autumn evening, as their lesson concluded, Mason lingered at his desk while Harriet gathered her materials. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his vest pocket. He pulled out a small wooden carving, a delicate rose with intricately detailed petals. Harriet took it carefully, marveling at the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "Did you make this?" Mason nodded, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. "Whittling helps me think. I've been working on it during evening watch." "Thank you," Harriet said softly, touched by the gesture. "But why a rose? When I first saw you at the station, despite your city clothes and proper manner, I thought you looked like a wild prairie rose, delicate at first glance but strong enough to withstand the harshest conditions." His voice lowered. "You proved me right in that canyon." Harriet felt heat rising to her face under his steady gaze. "I only did what anyone would do in that situation." "No," Mason said firmly. "Not anyone would have risked their life for a stranger. You're extraordinary, Harriet Zimmerman." The atmosphere in the schoolroom shifted, charged with unspoken feelings. Mason took a step closer, close enough that Harriet could see the flecks of darker blue in his eyes. "Harriet," he began, his voice husky. "I know I'm just a ranch foreman with little education and less to offer, but these past weeks, I've come to the schoolhouse door swung open and Sarah burst in, breathless with excitement. 'Miss Zimmerman, there you are. Mr. Collins is asking for you both. There's a visitor from the railroad company, and he wants everyone to hear the news.' The moment shattered, Mason stepped back, his expression closing. "We'll be right there, Sarah." As they walked to the main house, a respectable distance between them, Harriet wondered what Mason had been about to say. The wooden rose felt warm in her hand, a tangible reminder of whatever had been interrupted. The news from the railroad representative was significant. The company had decided to establish a major depot in North Platte, which would bring increased business and opportunities to the area. Mr. Collins was particularly pleased because it meant better prices for his cattle and easier shipping. "This calls for a celebration," he announced. We'll host a harvest dance next Saturday. Sarah, start spreading the word to neighboring ranches. Mrs. Peterson will need your finest cooking. The prospect of a dance sent a ripple of excitement through the household. Harriet had attended formal balls in Philadelphia, but she suspected a Western harvest dance would be quite different. As the group dispersed to discuss the news, Mason caught her eye across the room and gave her a small nod before slipping outside. The week leading up to the dance was filled with preparations. The largest barn was cleared and decorated with autumn leaves and lanterns. Musicians were arranged, food was prepared, and everyone's best clothes were brushed and pressed for the occasion. On the evening of the dance, Harriet stood before the small mirror in her quarters, pinning up her chestnut hair. She'd worn her finest dress, a deep green silk that she'd brought from Philadelphia, saving it for special occasions. It wasn't the height of Eastern fashion, but its simple elegance suited her and brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. A knock at her door revealed Sarah, flushed with excitement in her own Sunday best. "Oh, Miss Zimmerman, you look beautiful," the girl exclaimed. "I came to walk with you to the barn. Everyone's already gathering." The barn was transformed. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the space cleared for dancing. A platform had been erected for the musicians, a fiddle player, a banjo picker, and an accordion player from town. Tables laden with food lined one wall, and hay bales arranged around the perimeter provided seating. Harriet felt a flutter of nerves as she entered. Most of the ranch hands and neighboring families were already present, and many heads turned as she and Sarah joined the gathering. She scanned the crowd, searching for one particular face. Looking for someone, the deep voice behind her made Harriet turn. Mason stood there, dressed in clean dark trousers and a white shirt with a string tie. His hair was neatly combed and he'd trimmed his beard. He looked handsome in a way that made Harriet's heart skip a beat. "You clean up well, Mr. Xavier," she said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "As do you, Miss Zimmerman," he replied, his eyes taking in her appearance with undisguised appreciation. "That color suits you." Before Harriet could respond, Mr. Collins called for everyone's attention. After a brief welcome and thanks to the railroad representative who was their guest of honor, he signaled the musicians to begin. The first notes of a lively reel filled the barn, and couples quickly formed for the opening dance. "Would you do me the honor?" Mason asked, extending his hand to Harriet. She placed her hand in his, feeling the strength and warmth of his calloused palm. "I should warn you, I'm not familiar with your Western dances." A smile touched his lips. "Then I'll have the pleasure of teaching you for a change." Mason proved to be an excellent dance partner, guiding Harriet through the unfamiliar steps with a natural grace that surprised her. As they moved together, spinning and stepping in time to the music, Harriet felt a joy she hadn't experienced in years. "You're a natural," Mason told her as the first dance ended and they paused to catch their breath. "I have an excellent teacher," she replied with a smile. They danced several more sets together, stopping occasionally for refreshments or to speak with others. Harriet met families she hadn't yet encountered, receiving warm welcomes and invitations to Sunday dinners. She noticed how respected Mason was among the community. Men sought his opinion, women offered him home-baked goods, and children looked up to him with admiration. As the evening wore on, the music slowed. The fiddle player began a waltz, and couples moved closer together on the dance floor. Mason's hand settled lightly on Harriet's waist as they joined the waltz. "I've been meaning to finish our conversation from the other evening," he said quietly, his blue eyes intent on hers. Harriet's pulse quickened. "Yes." "When I said I had little to offer, that wasn't entirely accurate," Mason continued. "I may not have wealth or education, but I have land of my own, a homestead claim about 5 miles west of here. I've been building a house there, working on it whenever I can spare time from my duties at Silver Creek." Harriet looked at him in surprise. "I had no idea. Few people do. Mr. Collins knows, of course. He's been supportive, allowing me to balance both responsibilities." Mason guided her through a turn, his steps never faltering despite the seriousness of their conversation. "I hope to move there permanently next spring, once the house is finished and I've saved enough to buy a small herd to start my own operation." "That's impressive," Harriet said sincerely. "Building your own future from nothing." Mason's expression grew more intense. The thing is, Harriet, I've been building it with someone in mind, someone I hoped might share it with me someday. The implication of his words hung in the air between them. Harriet felt as though the rest of the room had faded away, leaving only the two of them in their own private world. Mason, may I cut in? The railroad representative appeared beside them, smiling politely at Harriet. I've been hoping for a dance with the school teacher everyone speaks so highly of. Mason released her reluctantly, stepping back with a small bow. Of course. As Harriet was led away, she glanced back to see Mason watching her, his expression unreadable. Throughout her dance with the railroad man, who spoke enthusiastically about the future development of North Platte, Harriet's thoughts remained with Mason and his unfinished declaration. When the dance ended, Harriet looked for Mason among the crowd but couldn't find him. Sarah informed her that he'd been called away. One of the horses was showing signs of colic and needed immediate attention. He asked me to tell you he's sorry, Sarah added, and that he'd speak with you tomorrow. Disappointed but understanding the urgency of the situation, Harriet remained at the dance for another hour before retiring to her quarters. As she prepared for bed, she found herself standing at her window, looking out at the star-filled sky and wondering what tomorrow's conversation would bring. Morning came with an unexpected turn of events. Mr. Collins summoned Harriet to the main house immediately after breakfast, his expression grave. "There's trouble, Miss Zimmerman," he explained when she arrived. "A telegram came from town this morning. The railroad company wants to run their track directly through the eastern section of Silver Creek." "But that's where the school is located," Harriet said, dismayed. "Among other things, yes, they're offering compensation, but it would mean relocating several buildings, including your schoolhouse." Collins sighed heavily. "I've sent Mason into town to speak with their representatives and see if there's room for negotiation." The news cast a shadow over what should have been a normal school day. Harriet went through her lessons mechanically, her thoughts divided between her students and the uncertain future of the school she'd come to love. Mason didn't return until after dinner. Harriet was in her quarters, grading student work by lamplight, when a knock came at her door. She opened it to find him standing there, hat in hand, looking weary from his long day. "May I come in? I have news about the railroad situation." Harriet hesitated. Propriety suggested she shouldn't receive a man alone in her quarters after dark. But the seriousness of his expression and the importance of the news overrode her concerns. "Of course," she said, stepping aside. "Would you like some tea? I was just making a pot." Mason accepted the offer with a grateful nod, taking a seat at her small table while Harriet prepared the tea. In the lamplight, she could see lines of fatigue around his eyes and a tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there during their dance. "So," she said, setting a steaming cup before him, "what did you learn in town?" Mason wrapped his hands around the cup, drawing comfort from its warmth. "The railroad has made up its mind about the route. They claim it's the only feasible path given the terrain and their engineering constraints. So we'll lose the schoolhouse." Harriet felt a pang of sadness at the thought. "Not necessarily," Mason said, taking a sip of tea. "Mr. Collins and I discussed an alternative before I left. He's willing to rebuild the school on the western portion of the ranch, which would actually make it more centrally located for most of the families." Relief washed over Harriet. "That's wonderful news." "There's more," Mason continued, his expression shifting to something more difficult to read. "The compensation from the railroad is substantial. Mr. Collins intends to use part of it to expand operations, including building a proper house for the school teacher, one that's not attached to the school itself." "That's very generous of him," Harriet replied, sensing there was still something Mason wasn't saying. He set down his cup and met her gaze directly. "Harriet, I've spent all day thinking about what I was trying to tell you last night at the dance. Seeing how quickly things can change, how the railroad can just decide to cut through established land, it's made me realize I shouldn't wait to speak my mind." Harriet's heart began to race as Mason reached across the table and took her hand in his. "From the moment you threw that rope to save me in the canyon, I knew you were unlike any woman I'd ever met. These past weeks, watching you teach with such passion, seeing your kindness with the children, and your determination to help everyone learn, including a rough cowboy like me, I've fallen in love with you, Harriet Zimmerman." The words hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Harriet felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in Mason's face. "I know it might seem sudden," he continued when she didn't immediately respond, "and I understand if you need time to consider. My homestead isn't much yet, but it could be a good life. We could build something meaningful together." Harriet found her voice at last. "Mason, I am honored by your feelings, but you're right, it is sudden. I came west to be independent, to establish myself as a teacher." A flicker of disappointment crossed Mason's face, but he nodded, understanding. "I respect that. Your career is important, and I would never ask you to give it up." "Please let me finish," Harriet said gently. "I came west for independence, but I've found something. I wasn't looking for a community that values education as much as I do, and—" She squeezed his hand. "A man who sees me for who I truly am, not just as a proper Philadelphia lady, but as someone capable of throwing a rope into a flood to save a life." Hope returned to Mason's eyes. "What are you saying, Harriet?" "I'm saying I need a little time. Not to decide if I have feelings for you, I know that I do, but to be sure that marrying wouldn't mean giving up the teaching that means so much to me." Mason's face broke into a smile that transformed his weary features. "Harriet, the last thing I want is for you to give up teaching. In fact, I was hoping. That is, my homestead is within riding distance of where the new school will be built. You could continue teaching and still be my wife." The solution was so simple, so perfect, that Harriet laughed with relief. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" "Not everything," Mason admitted with a rueful smile. "I didn't think to bring a ring, for instance." Harriet stood and moved to a small wooden box on her dresser. She opened it and removed a simple gold band. "This was my mother's," she explained, returning to the table. "She gave it to me before she died, telling me to wear it when I found someone worthy of my heart." She placed the ring in Mason's palm. "I believe I have." Mason looked at the ring with reverence, then back at Harriet. "Are you saying yes?" "I'm saying yes," she confirmed, her voice steady and sure. Mason rose from his chair and pulled Harriet into his arms. Their first kiss was gentle, a tender promise of the life they would build together. When they parted, both were smiling through tears of joy. "There's one condition," Harriet said, her expression turning serious. Mason raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "You have to promise never to risk your life in a flood again. I don't think my heart could take it." Mason laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "I promise. Though I can't help but think that if I hadn't, we might never have found each other." "True," Harriet conceded. "Perhaps some floods bring blessings after all." They announced their engagement to Mr. Collins the next morning. The old rancher was delighted, clapping Mason on the back and kissing Harriet's cheek. "I had a feeling about you too," he confessed. "Especially after Mason insisted on being the one to rescue our new schoolteacher from the station despite the approaching storm." Harriet turned to Mason with surprise. "You insisted?" A hint of color rose in Mason's cheeks. "I might have volunteered rather enthusiastically when Mr. Collins mentioned a teacher was arriving." Mr. Collins chuckled, "Nearly knocked Joe over in his rush to saddle Rusty." The revelation that Mason had been drawn to her, even before they met, added a new dimension to their story. It wasn't just the shared danger of the canyon that had forged their connection, there had been a spark from the very beginning. Word of their engagement spread quickly through the Silver Creek community. Most were supportive, though Harriet noticed a few disappointed looks from some of the single women who had clearly harbored hopes regarding the handsome foreman. Sarah was especially excited, helping Harriet plan for a spring wedding that would take place after the new schoolhouse was completed. Mrs. Peterson promised a wedding feast that would rival the harvest dance in grandeur. Through the winter months, Mason divided his time between his duties at Silver Creek and work on his homestead. Whenever weather permitted, he took Harriet to see the progress on the house he was building for them, a sturdy two-story structure with large windows to capture the prairie light. "It's beautiful," Harriet told him sincerely on one such visit in early March, as they stood in what would be their front room. "I can already imagine us here." Mason wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her head as they looked out the window at the rolling plains that would be their home. "I started building it after the flood," he admitted. "Something about nearly dying made me realize I wanted more than just working someone else's land. And then when I got to know you, I built it larger than I'd originally planned, added more windows because I noticed how you love natural light. Harriet turned in his arms, touched by the revelation. You were building it for us before you even knew if I returned your feelings. I was building it with hope, Mason corrected, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Hope that someday you might. As spring arrived, bringing new growth to the prairie, construction on the new schoolhouse was completed. It was larger than the original, with better lighting and more comfortable furnishings benefits of the railroad compensation. Harriet threw herself into preparing the new space, arranging books and maps with loving care. 2 weeks before their planned wedding, disaster struck again. Heavy spring rains combined with snowmelt from the mountains created flooding conditions throughout the region. Cottonwood Canyon, where Harriet and Mason had taken shelter the previous summer, was once again filled with raging water. Word reached Silver Creek that a family traveling to North Platte had been caught in the deluge. Their wagon had overturned at the canyon entrance, and though the parents and 2 older children had made it to higher ground, their 5-year-old daughter had been swept into the canyon. Without hesitation, Mason organized a rescue party. Harriet watched with a mix of pride and fear as he prepared to leave, checking ropes and gathering supplies with efficient movements. Be careful, she pleaded, helping him pack bandages and blankets. Remember your promise. Mason kissed her quickly. I remember. I don't intend to leave you a widow before you're even a wife. The rescue party returned 6 hours later, exhausted but triumphant. The little girl had been found clinging to a fallen tree halfway down the canyon. Mason had secured himself with ropes and descended the slippery rock face to reach her, bringing her safely back to her grateful family. As Harriet helped tend to Mason's scraped hands and bruised ribs, she couldn't decide whether to kiss him or scold him. You said you wouldn't risk your life in a flood again, she reminded him, her voice tight with emotion. Mason winced as she applied salve to a particularly deep scrape. Technically, I wasn't in the flood this time, just climbing down to where it had been. Harriet gave him a look that suggested she wasn't amused by the distinction. Mason's expression softened. Harriet, if it had been our child, wouldn't you want someone to try? The simple question disarmed her completely. Of course she would. It was one of the things she loved most about Mason, his instinctive need to help others, regardless of personal risk. Our children are going to have the bravest father in Nebraska, she conceded, pressing a gentle kiss to his forehead. But please try to stay alive for them and for me. 2 days before their wedding, Harriet received an unexpected letter. It was from her brother in Philadelphia, informing her that he would be in Omaha on business and hoped to attend the ceremony. Harriet was overjoyed. She had resigned herself to marrying without family present, and the prospect of having her brother witness her happiness meant more than she could express. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, a perfect spring morning. The ceremony was to be held outdoors, beneath a canopy of newly leafed cottonwood trees near the creek that gave Silver Creek its name. Chairs had been arranged in rows, with an aisle of wildflowers leading to a simple arch twined with prairie roses. In her quarters, Harriet prepared with Sarah's help, donning a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Peterson and several other women had helped her make. Her brother, William, who had arrived the previous evening, waited to escort her. You look beautiful, Hattie, he said, using his childhood name for her. Mother and father would be proud. Harriet blinked back tears. Do you think they would approve of Mason, of this place? William smiled, taking her hands in his. They would approve of your happiness. And from what I've seen of your Mason, they would approve of him too. He's a good man, Hattie. Anyone can see that. When the time came, Harriet walked on her brother's arm toward the man who had saved her life in more ways than one. Mason stood waiting beneath the arch, dressed in a new black suit, his blue eyes never leaving her as she approached. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows and rings before the minister, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever floods or droughts life might bring. When Mason kissed his bride, a cheer went up from the gathered community, a family they had both found in this wild and beautiful land. The celebration lasted well into the evening, with dancing and feasting beneath the stars. As midnight approached, Mason led Harriet away from the festivities toward where a wagon waited to take them to their new home. Are you ready, Mrs. Xavier? He asked, helping her into the wagon. "I've been ready since you pulled me from that flood," Harriet replied, her eyes shining in the moonlight. As they drove toward their homestead, Harriet rested her head on Mason's shoulder, reflecting on the journey that had brought them together. She had come west seeking independence and a purpose. She had found those things, but also something she hadn't known: she was missing a love as vast and enduring as the prairie itself. "What are you thinking?" Mason asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm thinking about water," Harriet replied. "How it can destroy and create, separate and unite, how a flood brought us together." Mason smiled, understanding perfectly. "Then I'm grateful for every drop of rain that fell that day." Under a canopy of stars, they continued toward their new home and the life they would build together, a life forged in danger, strengthened by respect, and sustained by a love that, like the land itself, would endure through all seasons. 5 years later, Harriet stood on the porch of their homestead, watching as Mason taught their 4-year-old son, William, to throw a lasso. The boy's attempts were endearingly clumsy, the rope barely forming a circle before collapsing in the dust. But Mason's patience was infinite, his encouragement steady. "That's it, Will," he called. "You're getting the motion right. Remember how your mama saved me with a rope just like this?" William nodded solemnly. He'd heard the story of the flood countless times. It was his favorite bedtime tale. "And then you got married and had me." "Well, there were a few steps in between," Mason laughed, ruffling the boy's dark hair. "But that's the important part." Harriet smiled, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child grew. She still taught at the school 3 days a week, with an assistant handling the other days. The railroad had indeed transformed North Platte, bringing growth and prosperity to the region. Silver Creek Ranch had expanded, and their own homestead now boasted a small but healthy herd of cattle. Life wasn't always easy. There had been droughts and blizzards, hardships and sorrows. But through it all, the love that had sparked in a flood-ravaged canyon had only grown stronger. As if sensing her thoughts, Mason looked up and met her gaze across the yard. The same warmth and tenderness that had drawn her to him still shone in his eyes, undimmed by the passing years. "Come join us," he called. "Show our son how it's really done." Harriet laughed and descended the porch steps. "I don't know if I still remember how." "Some things you never forget," Mason said softly as she reached them. Like the day a schoolteacher from Philadelphia saved a cowboy from drowning and changed both their lives forever. As their son ran off to chase a butterfly, Mason pulled Harriet close, his hand gentle on her rounded belly. "No regrets?" he asked, a question he still posed occasionally as if amazed by his good fortune. Harriet stretched up to kiss him, pouring 5 years of love and partnership into the gesture. "Only that I didn't throw that rope sooner," she whispered against his lips. Above them, clouds gathered on the horizon, not threatening, but promising the rain that would nourish their land and sustain their future. Together they watched them approach, unafraid of whatever storms might come.